Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here. Last week on this channel we took an in-depth look at Marvel vs Capcom 2, the fourth instalment within the Capcom vs series. The series kicked off with X-Men vs Street Fighter, followed by the Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter game, and then Marvel vs Capcom itself. The fourth game in the series, Marvel vs Capcom 2, was much bigger and arguably better than any of the games that came before it, and the fact that it was developed to run on Sega Naomi hardware pushed the series to the limits. In some ways we had seen everything that was possible from the Marvel vs Capcom concept. Marvel vs Capcom 2 would not be the only game from the Versus series released in the arcades and on the Sega Dreamcast in the year 2000 though, as by the summer the gaming world would receive the release of Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000. One of several crossover games that would see representatives from these two companies fighting it out. So, with this in mind, let us go back and look at how this all fell into place, and why this game was so important. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000. Yeah! To start this story off, I'm going to take you back to 1998. Capcom have just released one of their most polished fighting games, Street Fighter Alpha 3, the 90s most refined Street Fighter Alpha game that featured a more expansive roster of fighters than ever before. Fellow arcade giants SNK had recently released the fighting game The King of Fighters 98 for both the Neo Geo arcade and home console. King of Fighters 98 and Street Fighter Alpha 3 were both critical successes, and for many years, particularly in South America and Asia, many fans would debate over which of the two franchises was better. However, with Capcom and SNK being direct rivals within both the fighting game and arcade market, the chances of seeing the characters from these two games ever face off seemed slim. Street Fighter Alpha 3 and King of Fighters 98 would be covered by a number of gaming publications, obviously even in the same magazines due to being released around the same time. A magazine known as Arcadia would be one of these publications, and since they were covering both games, in typical clickbait fashion they smacked King of Fighters vs Street Fighter across their bloody front cover. This would lead many people who purchased the magazine to automatically assume there was a crossover in the works, and it would only be a matter of time until we saw the cast of Street Fighter duke it out with the King of Fighters. The magazine's arguably misleading clickbait led to a general uproar within the magazine's metaphorical comment section, with many readers voicing their annoyance at the publication's content creators. Some say that this racket and noise grabbed the attention of both Capcom and SNK, which would supposedly result in the two companies initially signing an agreement that they could make one fighting game each, using each other's intellectual properties. In addition to this, SNK would also make some SNK vs Capcom card games, but we will get into talking about these another time. With regards to Capcom and SNK making one fighting game each using both sets of IPs, the company struck a deal that would entail that the distributing company would gain all the profits from the game they had published, and not the company that licensed the characters for use, basically meaning that Capcom would take all the money from the game they made and SNK would receive the whole pot from the game they had made. The first of these two games would be published by SNK and see a release in 1999. The game would be titled SNK vs Capcom The Match of the Millennium and would arrive exclusively on the Neo Geo Pocket Color handheld. Now I could talk about this game now, but I'm actually going to save speaking about this one for another time, as every Thursday we are currently focusing on Versus games developed by Capcom, so let's move straight on to talking about Capcom's offering. Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000 would first arrive in the arcades in Japan on August the 13th in the year 2000. Like Marvel vs Capcom 2, that was released the same year, the game would run on the powerful Sega Naomi hardware, the arcade board that shared many of the same components with that of the Sega Dreamcast. Once again, like with Marvel vs Capcom 2, the hardware similarities between the Naomi and Sega home console would make porting the game over to the Dreamcast extremely easy. which would result in the game arriving in homes just 1 month later. Anyway, without further ado, let us check out the introductory scene of Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000. Yeah!
Capcom.
Capcom versus SNK. Millennium Fight 2000.
Capcom versus SNK. Millennium Fight 2000.
As you can see from the game's introduction, the rumour that nobody believed was true was now a reality. The opening scene tries to hype the player by showing screenshots from a number of old Street Fighter and King of Fighters games. The text suggests that it is finally time to establish who is the strongest. So let's take a look at this unbelievable game. Rather than arriving instantly at a player select screen when starting the game, you're instead asked to select a groove, with the two choices either being Capcom or SNK. The two grooves are essentially two different gameplay systems, both of which we shall talk about shortly. From there, you then reach the character select screen, where you pick fighters, followed by a choice between playing at either normal or turbo play speed. Now let's talk about the game's roster. The game features 33 different playable characters, with 28 of those being available from the beginning and the other as unlockables. As expected, the game presents as an even split of both characters from the Capcom universe with those from the SNK universe. Interestingly, and perhaps even disappointingly, aesthetically, the roster is not as diverse as Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and as a result there are far less cutesy and zany characters present. No Mega Mans, Rolls or Amingos here. In fact, when it comes to Capcom's offerings, nearly every fighter is just from the Street Fighter franchise. The only exception to this is Morrigan, who features as the lone non-Street Fighter Capcom character. I guess they just must have wanted this game to have a slightly more serious tone. On SNK's side of things, the roster would mix characters from the King of Fighters, Fatal Fury, The Art of Fighting, and even Samurai Showdown, leading to a little more diversity in terms of franchises on the SNK side of things. However, most of the characters all look like they mean serious business. I guess compared to Marvel vs. Capcom, this game was no laughing matter. I guess Capcom having their characters face off with comic book superheroes and villains was just a rough and tumble, but against fighting game characters from another company, this was war. As you would expect from a game containing roster members from various 2D fighting games, Capcom vs SNK is a 2D fighting game. With regards to the game's fighting mechanics, let us start off by talking about the two grooves. The Capcom groove is a gameplay system that has been taken straight from the Street Fighter Alpha series, which basically consists of filling the 3-level combo gauge in order to perform more powerful special moves. The SNK groove, on the other hand, consists of manually charging up the meter by holding down both heavy attack buttons in order to perform super moves. In addition to this, the SNK groove also features something known as Desperation Mode, which gives a fighter an advantage when their life is nearly depleted. In terms of gameplay mechanics, this title introduces more than just a groove system though. The game also entails something known as the ratio system, which results in every character in the game being split into 4 different groups. The 4 groups are all based on strength, with ratio 1 characters being the weakest, with ratio 4 characters being the top of the food chain. This means that when commencing a match or an entire playthrough, you must select a team, but the combined team's ratio must equal no higher than 4. For example, you could pick a team of multiple ratio 1 characters, or you could just pick one character from ratio 4. The choice is yours. In terms of how the characters were split into these 4 groups, ratio 2 just appears to be more popular characters than that of those from ratio 1. Ratio 3 appears to be characters who were bosses in previous games, and Ratio 4 seems to be more powerful hidden fighters such as Akuma, Evil Ryu, and Orochi Iori, if I am pronouncing that right, which I doubt I am. To state the obvious, fights are won in this game when all the fighters on the opposing team have been knocked out. As expected, the sizes of the teams vary depending from which ratio group fighters have been chosen from. The ratio system in this game sadly leads to a few drawbacks. For example, the combinations of fighters in regards to different teams you can form is limited and restrictive, as the ratio can never add up to more than 4. So the huge variation in teams, like in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, is absent here. The other drawback is a character is only as powerful as that of the person who happens to be controlling them. So calling the Ratio 4 characters the most powerful is kind of subjective really. In most cases you probably have a better chance of winning most fights with 4 Ratio 1 characters rather than just 1 Ratio 4. As although the Ratio 1 characters deal less damage with regular attacks, their specials and their combo abilities can be very effective. So strength in numbers often seems to be the winning formula here. Although these issues can be somewhat rectified later in the game when you unlock the ability to edit character ratios in versus mode, opening up a lot more choice and ability to create more tailored teams. In terms of the game's visuals, personally I think they look pretty fantastic. The matches take place in glorious 2D, with most of the Capcom sprites appearing to have been plucked from the Street Fighter Alpha series, and the SNK ones all being drawn from scratch. A strong case could be made that the SNK lineup of characters redrawn in the Street Fighter art style arguably looks even better than ever before. The stage backdrops look absolutely great. They are more detailed than any found in the earlier Marvel vs. games, and have certainly aged a lot better than the 3D backgrounds found within Marvel vs. Capcom 2. The stages in this game are bright, vivid and offer a lot of movement. In terms of play modes, the Dreamcast version of the game offers an arcade, versus, practice and team attack mode, as well as a secret mode where you can spend your points accumulated throughout the game on alternate costumes and stages, automatically giving the game additional single player replay value over many older fighting games. So as you can see, Capcom vs SNK is a very different beast to the Marvel vs Capcom series, and features many gameplay elements that widely differ from the games within that series. With this said, I guess it is time to go back and look at how this game was received by journalists of the time period. They absolutely loved Marvel vs Capcom 2 earlier that year, but what did they think of the first Capcom vs SNK game on a home console? Let us find out. GameSpot would review the game favourably, summarising that, issues of balance aside, Capcom have produced a great game. Though the SNK characters' repertoires of moves had to be simplified in order to fit into the Capcom scheme, what remains of them works quite well in the present context. Fans of either series would do well to check the game out, as it needn't be reiterated how tempting fights between the characters of these rival companies are to watch unfold, let alone have an active hand in. The video game critic would add to this with, the graphics here are stellar, and the backgrounds are the best I've seen in any fighter, hands down. Many of the stages have interesting intro sequences as well, and the excellent music is also worth noting. Gaming Target would pile the praise on by stating, if there is only one fighting game to get for the rest of the year, surely this is it. It may have its share of slight problems, but the stupendous gameplay is just too good to pass up. IGN loved this game too, and would round their write-up up with, Capcom vs SNK shouldn't be measured by what it isn't, but instead by what it is. A slightly flawed, if not terrific fusion of some of the best fighting games to ever grace our consoles. Capcom vs SNK stands tall as one of the single greatest Dreamcast games ever released. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The game was popular with critics despite the game's minor flaws. When it comes to Capcom though, you know just one single iteration of a game is never enough. So as a result, Capcom vs SNK will be back in the following year with a new iteration of the game. This update would be known as Capcom vs SNK Pro. So let us have a look at what this version was all about. The game introduced 2 new characters, Joe Higashi from Fatal Fury along with Dan Hibiki from the Street Fighter Alpha series. On top of this, existing characters would be given new moves and new play modes were introduced. But was it really worth releasing this update to the game just 1 year after the last version? Pro was released on 2 different home consoles eventually, the first of which was the Sega Dreamcast. The Dreamcast version of the game was released exclusively in Japan, which one would probably put down to the slow death of the Dreamcast in North America. The game remains largely the same as its predecessor, with very few tweaks here and there. GameSpot would cover this Japanese exclusive, praising the game for many of the same reasons they did the previous year. However, they would also state that if you already have the first game and have played it long enough to unlock many of its secrets, you'll find that picking up an import copy of Millennium Fight Pro amounts to nothing more than paying full price for 2 characters, and that just isn't worth it. Away from the Dreamcast, the existence of Capcom vs SNK Pro would lead to the game being released on the Sony PlayStation. But let us keep in mind that Capcom vs SNK was designed to run on the Sega Naomi, so how well could the much weaker Sony PlayStation do when it came to handling the game? Especially when you consider that the system had never been good when it comes to running 2D sprite-based titles. For a PlayStation title, Capcom vs SNK Pro is decent, but it pales in comparison to its Dreamcast counterpart. The colour palette looks more washed out, and the sprites look less vibrant too. Cuts were also made to both the character and background animations, making movement less fluid as a result. But apart from those differences, the game is not as hindered as the Marvel vs Capcom series on the platform. IGN would cover the PlayStation version of this game, stating, "There hasn't been a PS1 fighter this good since Alpha 3. Dreamcast vets, however, may want to stay away, as there's nothing here to entice those folk to go the downgrade route. Even still, Capcom vs SNK is a great slugger and deserves our wholehearted recommendation for the new and uninitiated alike." GameSpot on the other hand would be a little less positive with their version, stating Capcom vs SNK Pro for the PlayStation is about as good a port as it could be, all things considered. However, there are a lot of things to consider. The game is on the aged PlayStation hardware, it has some pretty substantial load times, it doesn't play very well with the standard DualShock controller, and thanks to its lower graphical resolution, it tends to have less detailed backgrounds and ugly special effects. It's also a port of a game that came out 2 years ago. So, that about rounds off all the different versions of Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000. The first version of the game on the Naomi and Dreamcast was a beautiful little title that offered a play experience that was largely different from Marvel vs Capcom 2 that launched the same year. Although the ratio system was flawed in places, it was interesting to see Capcom try something new with their tried and tested fighting game genre. Capcom vs SNK Pro on the other hand stinks of a typical Capcom style cash grab, where they release the same game with minimal changes multiple times in a greedy effort to make a little bit of extra cash. I guess they had those SNK IPs and they wanted to milk them for all they were worth. Obviously, if you know your fighting game history, you will be aware this was not the final game released by Capcom that would feature SNK characters. However, that is going to be a story for another time. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of the game and which fighting games you would like to hear me cover on here in the future. If you enjoyed today's video, please give me a like, subscribe and ring that notification bell to ensure you know whenever I upload a video. Finally, my channel Top Hat Gaming Man is partially funded by those who support me on Patreon, who make the daunting task of making videos full time on YouTube just that little less scary. So a huge thank you to Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, JD Robbins, Synth Spaces, Andrew Bazanski, Antonio Rodriguez, Asobi Kwang DX, Computer Man, Craig Jenkins, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott and the rest of my generous supporters. Thank you all for your support.